Welcome back to the 4-part lab series, So You Want to Animate, where Nol Honig and I break down the process of animating your designs from scratch. And this here is my buddy Bandit. He helps me do a lot of the work I do by just sitting and napping in the corner. We're now in part 2 of the lab series, and if you missed the first part, let me reintroduce myself. My name is Sarah Beth Morgan, and I am a director and illustrator based in Portland, Oregon. I'm also an instructor for Skillshare and School of Motion, where I break down this process even further, the process of designing for animation from scratch. There's a lot of intricacies I can't go over in the hour that we have together here. In part 1 of this Adobe Lab series, I touched on the very beginning stages of animating your designs from scratch, and that's really starting with the design process. We discussed the different levels of motion and how we're really going to be focusing in on that level 1 type of motion, where we take simple designs and add subtle looping movement to them. I also expanded on what an illustrator in the motion industry does on a day-to-day basis, including sketching and storyboarding and planning for motion from the very first brushstroke. Right now, in part 2 of this lab series, we're going to open up that Photoshop file I began in the last part, in part 1. We'll finish up that design and then we'll make sure the file is ready to pass off to Nol Honig, who is going to be taking this design and actually bringing it into After Effects and showing y'all how to animate. Like I mentioned last time, you are more than welcome to take this file that I have here and bring that into After Effects and animate it in parts 3 and 4. You can also follow along with the client brief from Fruits of the Trade, or you can take a design that you already have that kind of meets the simple criteria for animating here. You probably don't want to choose something too complicated. And here's the brief that we had last time, just to give you a little refresh. It's Fruits of the Trade. They have some specifications here on what they need for their Instagram post. They want you to illustrate a fruit, kind of using whatever style you like. And then they also say that you need to have a little label on the bottom, so we're going to learn how to animate type. But yeah, feel free to create your own design from scratch. And while you're doing that, also feel free to ask questions in the chat pod. I'll do my best to answer them. All right, well, let's get started. Thanks so much for joining today. All right, so here I am in Photoshop. You can see I've got my Cintiq all set up. And here's the sketch I started on in part 1. I obviously chose to sketch clementines. I decided to go with that for my fruit of choice. One thing I didn't really touch on in part 1 was the storyboarding and concept phase for this design. And the reason I didn't really go into depth here was that this calls for more of a subtle and simple animation, and we don't really need to think too hard about transitions or big sweeping movements. This is more just like a subtle thing that's happening. If we look back on this level 1 animation style, it's really great because it feels like a level of animation we could apply to any design that already exists. So if any of you have designs you've already made, say a logo or a simple Instagram post that you've already posted, or a flat, clean graphic on your website that you want to bring to life, you should really be able to apply these level 1 animations to any of that. Now, compare those level 1 images to these examples. You'll see that these don't really originate from one single image. These are multiple images strung together in clever ways through transitions. So if we look at this pep rally animation here, we really see that we're going from a close-up of the fire to pulling out and seeing a character kind of speaking or yelling into the microphone, which is also on fire. Out of context, I don't really know what it relates to, but you can tell there's a couple steps that went into planning the shot. If we look at this piece here by You.Do, we can see there's a lot of thought put into the way that the image will loop and animate over time. There's a lot of extra moving elements that you would have to plan out that wouldn't necessarily just be in one image. Same with this Wevoke Showreel intro. They've got a little mock-up, a little vignette for each letter, which is really cool, and I love how they've played with this, but it's like you'd have to design maybe, I haven't really counted, but maybe like 8 frames to make this come to life. So there's a lot more than just one simple image. It would be like, say I drew 10 different fruits for Fruits of the Trade, and then I cut between each of them and each of them animated. That would be a whole different level of a project, right? So for something like this, it's a bit more complex, and we'd have to think more about the progression of images and how everything works together in tandem. if I were going to make my clementines and make them grow into a tree, or if I were to make them spin around and transform into a pair of apples, I'd have to apply more thought to the storyboarding phase to really think about how things were going to move. But working in level 1 animation is so great because it essentially opens up a ton of doors for you to go back and apply motion to work you've already done. I also really think there's a lot of beauty and simplicity, and adding little bits of animation to everything can really level up your design work. But back to this design here, my clementines. I imagine there's plenty of opportunity for movement here. Perhaps we imagine that the clementines are still attached to a tree and they're swaying gently in a breeze. I can see the fruit moving subtly back and forth, maybe offset the leaves a bit so they're moving at a different pace than the branches are. Maybe there's slight rotation of the fruit. There's a lot of things that could happen that don't necessarily require storyboarding or transitions. And of course, once we have the type on here, I can also animate that. So there's a lot of little things that we can add motion to. All right, so let's begin color blocking here. This is actually how I begin almost all of my illustrations after I'm done with the sketch phase. This is where your file actually has to become organized and you have to follow some rules so that you don't affect the animator's ability to manipulate those layers later on. I start by laying all of the main colors out in the main shapes and then add textures and detail afterwards. A key thing to keep in mind is organization as you're working. An animator that you hand your file off to, or you as the animator, are going to have a lot of trouble sifting through a file in After Effects if everything is named layer 5 or layer 253 and so on. And of course, I'm sure you know this, but it's really important for animation because you can't really preview the image of what's in the layer like you can in Photoshop. It's a lot harder to kind of like figure out where things are. So as I'm working, I like to make sure that everything stays pretty organized from the start so I don't have to go back and do guesswork later on. So name everything as you go. Do not flatten your layers together unless you want things to be animated as one unit. When we're done with our design, we will also make sure to delete any unnecessary or hidden or empty layers. But don't worry about that just yet. We're gonna, duplicate our file like I said and make it animation friendly. But just keep these in mind as you're working if you're coloring in a sketch that you created in the last part of this lab. Before I fully, show you my color blocking phase, I kind of want to just expand on what I just said about not flattening layers. If you have the circle of the clementine here, and then you have a separate layer with the stem, and obviously those are separate layers right now, so if I went into After Effects, I could move the stem separately, or I could have the clementine rotate or something like that. But if I flatten them, obviously they're just going to move as one unit. So you don't really want to do that because if the animator isn't recreating your file, if they're just using the assets that you already have in your layers, then it's going to be really awkward for them. They're going to have to, cut things up, mask things, break things apart to have to make it animation friendly. Of course, animators do this kind of work all the time, but if we can do our best as illustration or design folks to help that along, and it'll make it easier on ourselves if we're animating our own work, then we might as well just keep everything separate. It doesn't really hurt, right? All right, so as you can see right here, I have already chosen some colors to work with. I'm not going to go into detail on how to choose color palettes or how to use Photoshop itself because this lab is really focusing on animation and After Effects primarily. Like I said earlier, sometimes After Effects will recognize shape layers, so I'm going to start by using just circles for the clementines. First, I'm going to change the background color, and I'm going to use this nice light beigey color because I think it'll be really nice with the contrast of the orange fruits. So that started. I always turn my sketch layer down to like 10% and put it on top on multiply mode so I can see it as I'm working. And here's kind of where I'm going to start separating out my layers as I'm working. I'm going to use a shape layer to create these clementines. I'll start with the back clementine first because it's going to be underneath layer-wise. And I will just name that Clementine Behind. And then I'm going to duplicate that so they're the same size, Command J, and name that one Clementine Front. and drag that over to where it is in the sketch. I've obviously got my 2 clementines. I'm gonna actually start grouping things because that's just how I keep things organized. You'll see later on that I'm gonna do some manipulation with the file for the animator, but for right now, this is gonna be really helpful. I might put like a little black circle for where the stem is supposed to enter, and I will name that layer stem hole, because why not? This is like where I get really creative when I need to name things. I just use the weirdest terms. And then I'm going to make a separate group for the stem. And because I want the stem to kind of have an organic feel, I'm just going to use a clean sketch brush that I have saved in my brush groups. And I'm going to make sure to keep the 2 parts of the stem separate so that if Nol needs to use that to animate later on, he has that capability. All right, and then as far as color blocking goes, I really just need to do the leaves now. And of course, like I said, I'm not super adept at Illustrator myself, but if it's easier for you to make these shapes in Illustrator rather than draw them by hand, like if you're using a mouse or a tablet instead of a Wacom's and teak, feel free to do that because everyone has their own process. Personally, I just like how the edges feel when they're drawn by hand for my own capability. And then also, of course, I'm going to be adding texture, so it'll help a lot for me personally to just have all of this in Photoshop already. But if you want to use Illustrator shapes, go for it. Now I'm also going to add my type, and so that we can all use it, I'm going to use an Adobe Typekit font. So that should be available to everyone who has Creative Cloud. And I'm going to kind of space things fun to give it a little bit of personality. I also am thinking about hierarchy here, especially if we're adding some animation. We want everyone to pay more attention to the illustration itself, not the type, so I'm keeping the type pretty subtle. So without a doubt, most animators will probably end up recreating your assets with shape layers in After Effects. Recreation is unfortunately something that animators have to do a lot in the motion industry. Sometimes this is unavoidable, especially if you've designed your file in raster with no shape layers, but I just want you to be aware of this so you understand how After Effects animators work. But just experiment here with the rest of this lab series and we'll see what works best for you in your own process. So the next thing to do here would be to add textures and details to my color blocked shapes. And I want to take you on a little segue here to talk a little bit about the different texturing methods we can use for animation in our design file here. Textures are definitely one of the biggest roadblocks for animators. They can be a real hassle. Be conscious of this when either diving into After Effects or handing off your file to another animator. What I would personally define as a texture could be any of the following. This could be a lighting layer that you add to shapes. It could be shading that you add. It could be an overall rough texture, like maybe a pattern or something. So obviously I already said don't flatten any layers, but especially don't flatten any texture layers. And I want to show you why you should keep those layers separate, don't crop them, etc. So if I'm going to add a texture to this layer right here, to my clementine layer, say I was just going to add like a fun graphic texture like this or something. If this layer is separate, the animator has the capability to like move it back and forth. So say they want to create the illusion of the clementine turning or something, they could actually use the texture to emulate that. But if these 2 layers are flattened together by pressing Command E, there's no way I can separate that texture. The animator is going to have to go in and recreate it or something, or they're just going to have to mess with it how it is, which sometimes it's okay to do that if it's really subtle and small, but most of the time it's much nicer to have the capability to move it around separately. So I also want to go into some different types of textures. So I have come up with some terms: connected, independent, and moving textures. And As it says here, these are just terms I made up, but I think they define the texture types pretty well. You can see with these images here, especially in this Wanderlust image, you can see that the polka dots are mapped to the bed as if it was actually a polka dot pattern on the comforter. I would say that a connected texture is basically as if the texture is glued to the surface it's on. And you can see that also in the Sebastian Curie Romain Lubrissin. The line pattern is moving with the shapes, and the shadows are connected, kind of glued to the edges of those shapes. So that would be a connected texture, and that's probably the most typical kind of texture you would see with an animator. I also have here what we call independent textures. These will be textures that are separated from the object that's being animated. So that means either A, the textures don't move with the object at all and they're just kind of pasted behind the object, or B, they move independent of the object. So maybe the object is staying still and there's a pattern moving across it. So you can kind of see that in these examples here. In this ordinary folk example, we have the fish moving up and down, but you can see the texture is kind of just being revealed behind it. Especially you can see that really clearly in this bottom half of the fish. Then we also have moving textures, another term I made up, but I would just say these are essentially animated textures. They're actually moving themselves, not just moving with the motion of an object. These can be either connected or independent. So with this one by Ian Sigmund, he animated the texture with the motion of the object. Basically, he probably went into Photoshop and animated each frame by hand. And then same with this one by Daniel Savage. We have this nice flowing motion of the waves behind the car, but then you can see the blue and pink texture has a wave of its own. So lots of different types of textures, lots of things I didn't think about as I was illustrating things when I first started in this industry. I think it's really good to know because there's a lot of different options for using textures in motion design. So really quickly here, I'm just going to do a little time lapse of me working on adding textures and details to these clementines. Most of this will be done through clipping masks. I'm going to keep everything in their correct layers and folders. I'm going to label everything as I go. And then afterwards, I'm going to meet you at the end. We are going to actually make a duplicate file for After Effects. Finally, we're almost there. So obviously here I was working in my normal way, which is grouping everything together, adding masks, but it'll be better for animation to remove some of these elements to make it easier on whoever's animating the file, and that's probably you. So these steps will help a lot. Let's walk through what prepping your file for animation looks like. 1, save your file, create a duplicate file labeled file name _animation PSD. Obviously, you can name this whatever you want, but this usually works pretty well. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've got my file here, gonna save it as animation. Fruits of the Trade, animation.psd. Next up is to delete any of your sketch layers or your color palette layers, or if you have a mood board in there, you can delete that too. So this is a good time to go in and pick apart your file. Just make sure there's nothing in there that you don't want animated. I'm just gonna open up everything. I realized I didn't label some things, so I'm gonna go back and do that. And then everything seems fine in the stem section. Leaves. I've got a layer in here that I have turned off that I'm not going to use, so I'm just going to delete that. I will delete my color palette and my sketch layer because I have that saved in my other file, so I don't have to worry about losing it completely if I need it again. The next step would be to ungroup any unnecessary groups or folders. Now I want to show you what I mean by that. Nol will go into this in a lot more detail, but essentially if you open up your file in After Effects, your Photoshop file, there's a couple steps you need to get there, but essentially once it's in there, you can see that everything that I had labeled as a group, so this stem group right here. In Photoshop, it was literally just a group called stem, but in After Effects, those groups are called pre-comps, and a pre-comp is like an animation file inside of an animation file. So you've got your main file, which has all of your groups, and then you press stem, and then it'll just take you to a group that only has the stem layers in it. But this is pretty annoying if you want to animate things in tandem. Say you want the stem to move separately, but also move with the orange circles, the clementines. It's really nice to actually have all of these elements, but if they're all grouped like so, it makes it a little difficult. So here's where we actually go into our Photoshop file before we get into After Effects and remove any of those groups. That's just gonna look like right-clicking any groups you may have and just saying ungroup layers. And so I think Nol's probably gonna wanna move the leaves around separately, so the leaves shouldn't be in one group, same with the stem pieces. But the type can be animated on its own. And then I feel like the clementines, since their textures will probably not be moving too much, they can stay within one of those pre-comps or groups. So it looks a little bit messier, expanded like this, but it'll help a lot in the long term in animation. Now that I brought that into After Effects, you can see that we actually have all those elements labeled now. Top stem, bottom stem, leaf top, leaf right, leaf bottom. They're all in the same composition now in After Effects, which will be a lot easier to move things in tandem together. Obviously, Nol will show you actually how to properly import your files. I just wanted to give you a little preview of how it all works and why you should not be using as many groups as you think you should. So up next, we have getting rid of non-essential masks. And I haven't used a lot of masks in here, but if we look here, I did kind of mask this highlight by just masking it out with another bit of that texture to give it a little bit more of a shape. But Nol's not really going to be using that mask for any purposes, so I'm just going to right-click the mask and say, Apply Layer Mask. And so now it's just that same texture, but there's just no mask to have that extra information there anymore, which is fine for this case. The next thing is to check for animation roadblocks. Now this one's a little bit trickier because there's no set rules for this. It's not really a technical thing. But something that I want to point out here is that with this clementine in the front, if I move it around, this shadow is probably going to have to change, which might get a little bit complicated for animation purposes if we're trying to go for that level 1 animation. So maybe it's better if we don't worry about the overlap of the fruits and we actually separate the fruit so that it's just a little bit easier to animate everything. We don't have to worry about the shadow appearing and then disappearing, and it just gets a little bit complicated when we have that overlap, especially if things are going to be kind of moving in the breeze. It's going to change your design a little bit, but it might actually help make your animations feel a little bit more finished. So I'm just going to separate the stems and move the clementines around a little bit to get rid of that overlap. So it looks a little different, but I'm still really happy with it, and I think it'll be a little bit easier for Nol to animate within the hour that he has with y'all. Essentially, the final step we have left is to change that 300 DPI resolution to 72 DPI so that Nol can use it properly in After Effects. The easiest way to do that is to go to Image, Image Size, and that'll bring up the dimensions and your DPI that you already have. Make sure you uncheck Resample and then change the resolution to 72. And obviously that will change the size of the canvas, so the pixels are still the same if we go and look at the actual dimensions, but the inch size is different. So now we've got it in 72 DPI, still 1500 by 1500 pixels. If we look back at the client brief, it seems like we hit all their specifications. And yeah, just save it from here. Save. So if we look back on all of this, we did everything, we saved it, we're ready to animate. We've done everything we need to do to hand that file off to Nol. And if you're going to be actually animating it yourself, give yourself a pat on the back because we did it, we're there, and we're ready to jump into After Effects. We're finally done prepping our file for After Effects, and you've made it to the end of part 2 of this 4-part lab series. I'm so excited that you stuck with me and that you're ready to move on to parts 3 and 4 with Nol, who's going to take my Clementine design file and actually turn it into that level 1 animation, that subtle looping animation. Okay, I think it's okay. You can sit down now, I know. So, just to recap what we learned, in part 1, I went over the beginning stages of planning for motion, creating that design file from scratch, storyboarding, learning about the different levels of animation. Then we created a sketch using a client brief. Moving on to part 2, I took that sketch and I started color blocking. We talked a bit about textures in motion. I also gave you some insight into prepping your files for motion, all the steps it takes to make it ready for After Effects. So, really excited to see what everyone comes up with. Just a reminder, if you have anything from this lab that you want to share, please post it on your Instagram and tag @Wonderfall, that's me, @Nol Honig, and then finally, of course, @Adobe. I'm really looking forward to potentially connecting with you over social media and also maybe in my illustration for motion course. Thank you again for joining. It's been a real pleasure. I'll see y'all later. Bye.